Hello, today is February the 12th, 2020, and if you're here for How to Become a Data-Driven Documentation Team with Joe Gelb and Orin, you are in the right place. Thanks for joining us. My name is Scott Abel, and I'm going to be the host of today's show. Let me tell you a few things about our Bright Talk webinars. First, we can't see or hear you, so you don't have to worry about your cameras or your microphones because you're isolated and you're just listening to us as a broadcast mechanism. And you cannot, even though you might want to, you can't chat with us back and forth. While you can submit a question to the presenters, and I'll queue them up at the end of the show and ask as many as possible, the presenters can't chat you back, so just be aware of that. What you can do during the show, though, are a few things. You can ask time remaining. You can also do a few other things. You can get help by looking in the attachments and links sections for some frequently asked questions. You can also give feedback on your way out the door. There's a 5-star rating system that the system will prompt you to give a rating between 1 to 5 stars. 1's a low rating, 5 is a high. The presenters love to get the feedback to know how they're doing, so please do that if you would on the way out the door. You can also access additional content in the attachments and links section of your webinar viewing panel, including a copy of the slide deck and some promotional materials from our sponsor. Speaking of sponsors, today's show is brought to you by Zoomin software. Companies spend millions of dollars creating valuable content, but they package it up as dated, static, and frustrating experience that customers don't enjoy. Zoomin lets you deliver up-to-date and personalized product answers wherever and whenever your customers need them, whether it's in your documentation center, your product support portal, or your online community. You can learn more about how Zoomin can help you improve by visiting them online at zoominsoftware.com. All right, without further ado, let's welcome to the virtual stage our first presenter, Joe Gelb, whose LinkedIn profile is listed right there. You'll also be able to see some information about Joe in the attachments and links section. Joe, welcome to the show.
Hey, Scott.
Nice of you to join us today. I'm assuming that you're broadcasting from Israel today. Is that correct?
Yes, I am broadcasting from Tel Aviv.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate it. And for your co-presenter, Lawrence, are you there with Joe?
I am indeed. Hello.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us again. You've both done previous shows on the Content Wrangler channel, so I know you're familiar with how this goes. For the audience members who have just joined us, we've got about 500 people signed up for today's show. For those of you who just joined in, you can leave a question using the Ask a Questions tab. That will be submitted to me, and while the presenters are doing their talk, I'll queue up all of the questions, and at the end of the show, with whatever time is remaining, we'll ask as many questions as possible. Lawrence and Joe, I'm going to on mute and allow you to drive the presentation forward. I'll jump back online if you need me, and if not, I'll join you at the end of the show for questions.
Sounds great. Thank you. Okay, let's get started.
Okay, so what we're talking about today is data-driven documentation teams, and those 3 Ds do add an extra dimension to your documentation. That's because when you use data to decide how your teams are going to operate, this is when you can really target your actions and get the best results.
So, as part of our discussion, or the beginning of our discussion of the 3 Ds, so we'd like to ask a very foundational question. What is your role in your organization? Okay. I'd like you to think about that for a few seconds. Okay, time's up. Okay, so you know, a lot of us are, a lot of you in the audience might be technical writers, or you might consider yourselves information architect, or content strategist, or content modeler, or all kinds of things like this. Okay, with all the different roles or titles or jobs that we have in our organization to create, manage, and publish content. But really the question is, like, what is your role? Okay, what is your role is not necessarily the same thing as your job. Okay, so when we talk about role is really how you focus on your contribution to the success of your organization. okay, the success of your organization as well as your customers. Okay, so when we talk about role, it's not just the job that we do. We're all busy creating and publishing content and throwing it over the fence for our customers to read and to use. And that's great, but really all this content that we're creating is really helping people to find answers. People are coming to you because they have questions about how to use your products, how to buy your products, whether they want to buy your product, how to get support, all kinds of things questions that come up during the use of your product, during the usage life cycle, the product life cycle. So really, we focus on your role in the success of the organization is really your contribution. And your contribution really is not just, being a writer or being a content strategist or whatever you are, but really helping people to find answers to questions that they have. Now, we talk about, data, which is the primary subject of today's talk. So the question is, why gather data? And how does that gathering of data help us to be successful in our role and really drive success in our organization? So when we talk about, different, success or, data that can help us to drive success, there's really two, types of categories of success or effectiveness in an organization. One is the successful, effectiveness or impact that you have on your organization, okay, across the entire enterprise. And we're going to talk shortly about how you really have a very, potentially large impact on your organization. And there's the data that will help us or help you to be productive and efficient within your own department. Okay, so there's really the data that's going to help you to be effective in the overall scheme of how you can help your customers and help your organization as a whole be effective and successful. And then there's the more, success of your own department to be efficient in how you're generating content and publishing content and everything that you're doing.
Right. So when you have data behind you, you can choose to use that data to be more effective within the broader context of what everyone else around you is trying to do. And we'll talk about how central you are to that in a minute. And then what most people use data for intrinsically or intuitively is to try to do their own job better. And what we'll see is that these are two sides of exactly the same coin, as we'll see shortly.
Right. Okay. So that data really helps us to highlight gaps in how we're creating content, mismatches, and just overall helping us to be more effective in how we're pushing out content and making that available. Okay, we're going to pause here for the first question. Okay, and the question is, do you use analytics to plan your content strategy? Okay, so I'll let you answer that question. And really, as you're answering that question, a lot of our organizations that we're talking to, are considering either they have some type of analytics in their, they go back to that question so you can see that. They have analytics or they're thinking about using analytics, and a lot of organizations we talk to, they have some type of analytics in their company, whether on their marketing site or on their support site. And a lot of companies are thinking about how to use analytics for their actual, for their documentation strategy. So it's very interesting for us to hear what you're thinking and where you are in your organization about, how you're planning the use of analytics in your own documentation strategy and how the strategy kind of plays out across, your role in the organization. So right now we have about half of you, about 50%, who are planning to use analytics in a rudimentary way. About 16% of you say yes, without any other type of qualification. And 35% of you are saying, 36% are saying no. So it's about half and half. About, I would say, looks like 65% or so of you are saying yes, you're planning to use analytics. And 35% of you are saying no. Okay, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Let's move forward. Great. Okay, so now we talked about what your role in your organization is. Now let's really talk about what that impact of your product content is. Now product content, we're talking about documentation, we're talking about maybe support content or, training, other types of technical information to help your customers and also your internal staff, to work better with your products, help to sell your products and everything else. So, when you talk about what is that impact of the product content, so the impact of your product content can really be mapped to overall corporate goals. And we talked about your goal is really focusing on your overall contribution to the success of the organization. So most corporations, have goals, and those goals are generally pretty high level, okay? And
so what would an example of a corporate goal be?
Yeah, so the corporate could be, increasing customer success or NPS by a certain percentage, right? Or, creating a better customer experience. Or it could be something very down to earth, like we want, or very numbers oriented, like we want to increase our sales by a certain percent, right? So the corporate goals are generally relatively high. I don't know if some of your companies that you work for use something like OKRs, different types of, methodologies for creating corporate goals. But generally, most companies are trying to set, overall corporate goals. And those goals really trickle down to each department, okay? So the corporation has larger, higher level goals, and each department needs to translate those goals into their own goals, which will help to, drive the success of those overall corporate goals. Now, each of those goals for each department generally ties down or dribbles down to KPIs, or key performance indicators, which are ways to measure the success in a very numerical, very data-driven way. And so each of your departments, are going to have their own KPIs to measure their own success. Okay? And now data can really drive the action of how to hit those goals, but also to measure the success, to see how you're doing to that success. Now, again, these are, every department in your organization is going to have their own personal goals. They're going to have their own KPIs, okay? And what we're going to be talking about now really is how you and how your content is really impacting on the success of each organization or each department, and how that really bubbles up into the corporate goals.
Right. So very often people who create content, the technical writing department, the documentation department, or whatever you guys call yourself in your organization, it's notorious for reporting to different branches of the organization, depending on which company you're in. So some technical writing departments reporting to the product branch, some reporting to engineering, others reporting to marketing. Some have a UX branch or an R&D services branch. Whichever one you report into, your manager has goals which must align with the corporation. He or she passes those goals on to you, and you then lead your team, or you are in a team of writers, and your role in this is to try to help your manager fulfill their goals as part of this larger organization. But what we will see is that documentation, even though you report into a single branch, you have a single manager who has their manager and so on, the documentation that you create actually has a very broad impact, much more than the narrow trickle down and trickle up to the corporate goals, where you will see shortly that your documentation can actually drive action across the organization.
Right. So when we talk about the impact of product content, I was going to call out some specific departments in your organization. So typically, most companies have some kind of product management or user experience, and those folks are concerned with, developing the product, about adaptation of features, new features, getting feedback on the usage of the product, and then assistance for using that product. Okay, and those folks have their own KPIs. Examples of KPIs may be the increase of people using the product, how many people are creating or giving feedback about the usage. Sometimes it might be duration of, how often people are using the product, and things like that. So these are examples of KPIs that a product management organization might be driving towards. we talk about a marketing part of the organization. So marketing people are often concerned with SEO, site getting traction to the website. They're concerned about that having a branded experience across the products and across the site. They're concerned with dynamic information and overall just trying to generate leads and drive business. And so those KPIs that they're thinking about are things like, increasing search traffic, increasing engagement from the sites, and also, having content coming from search, is kind of driving people to your organization. So the marketing people have their own KPIs that will, again, bubble up to the main goals, and these are some examples. If we look into sales enablement, okay, then we're talking about, a group that's trying to find, help the salespeople to drive sales. That may be finding content that would be useful for prospects, showing value of the products, and overall driving the effectiveness of the sales process. And that can manifest itself into KPIs such as, having higher retention rates on the site for people who are looking for information, increasing the upsell and cross-sell rates, increasing, conversion rates of marketing leads and things like this. Okay, so they have their own KPIs that they're driving towards. We talk about the customer success. So we're kind of moving around the circle from, developing products, marketing them, selling them, and then after you're selling them, actually, getting people onboarded with those products. So those customer success people really want to get your product installed and working as quickly as possible. Fewer calls because of people needing to get help, and just better information sharing. And those guys are really have KPIs such as like customer success scores or customer satisfaction scores such as NPS. They're looking to reduce the churn, meaning they want to keep people using your products. They're looking to upsell also. It's very often part of the customer success organization. And overall, providing a self-service function so that people can use your products without having to call a support agent. And then we're talking about customer support. So if someone actually has to contact your organization to get help. So we're talking about, number one, trying to deflect those cases via self-service, getting access to answers through various channels, whether it be a website, through in-product assistance, web widgets, things like this. And just overall creating a single source of consistent truth around the product. Something where, Lawrence and I are wont to wax poetic about this idea of, getting consistent branded content across all the different channels that people find content. We're going to pause that for now, being another webinar. But those people in the customer support are looking towards things like, increasing the first call resolution, reducing average handle time, increasing that case deflection, which means, increasing the chance that people don't have to call support, and just overall reducing the support costs and increasing the customer experience score. So you can imagine, you're all probably thinking, wow, my content really can impact the success of getting better support or self-service, or helping salespeople to sell this product, helping the marketing people to properly express the functionality that the products, and really the idea is helping you to maximize that impact of your product content.
Right. So let's just take a step back for a second. So what you're seeing here is the ways that product content, the content that you create, that typically you think of as being accountable to your manager, you can see how it's really at the heart of your organization. It's right bang in the center. It impacts directly on the goals and the KPIs of product management, of marketing, sales enablement, customer success, customer support. Each of those departments have their own KPIs. Each of them have their own goals. But your product content is instrumental in making sure that these guys can reach their goals. So instead of just thinking linearly as you try to reach the KPIs of your manager, we need to be thinking much more broadly about how our content can impact significantly on everyone's KPIs.
So, kind of summing up, the impact on your company, right? Your role to drive higher and positive impact on your company. Like Lawrence mentioned, you're reporting it to one department, but really you have an impact on all those key departments, whether that be sales enablement, marketing, product management, development, customer success, customer support. And really the idea is to maximize your impact on the rest of the organization. And really the type of information that you guys are all creating and making available, that really has a very high potential for very positive impact.
All right. So, so far we've looked at why you would gather data. It would be to help you increase the impact of, or to measure how your content impacts the goals of the rest of the company. Okay, and this is what Joe just took you through now in detail. How, for example, customer support has we have the AHT, average handling time, which needs to be reduced as part of the support call. The support measurements. That's one of the key indicators that they have when they measure their goals. So now it's time to look at productivity, and it's time to look at how you can use data to make your the process that you have to create content, how you can supercharge that, make that more interesting, and make it more efficient by highlighting the gaps, the mismatches, and also highlighting what you do well. Okay? So which kind of data would do that? Okay, which kind of data would improve your productivity? So one of the things that you'll want to be looking at when you're looking at the kind of data that you want is actionable data. Okay, because if you're just going to look at data, if you're just going to gather data, and when you look at it, you find that it's very entertaining and it's very interesting, but it actually doesn't lead you to do anything with it, well, I'm going to be a little brutal and I'm going to call that useless data. Okay, so I remember sitting through a very long, arduous presentation from the head of HR of a very large company that shall remain nameless, okay? And this guy, he was going through, he felt very pleased with himself. He was going through all of these charts and everything about how pleased people were in their department, how well they were doing, if they liked their manager or didn't. And he was like, 67% of people think that their managers are in the right place doing the right job. I think that's pretty good. And 27%, and he was just rolling out these statistics. And everybody was going, wow, that's really interesting. And they including me, I was also thinking, wow, But then after this, I'm thinking through all of this, and then afterwards, I ended up in this presentation, having heard all of these things, and I realized two things. I realized, number one, this guy is not going to do anything with this data, except continue to be pleased with himself. And number two, there's nothing for me to do with this data either. So it's just mildly amusing, mildly entertaining, but completely useless, okay? So I'm just going to say any data that doesn't lead to an action or it doesn't lead to anything at all is useless, okay? Next up, we've got scorecard data. Now, scorecard data can have its merits, okay? The scorecard data is basically when you look at some data and it tells you where you are on a scale of 1 to 10, for example, okay? And you can say, okay, I'm at 6, right, out of 10. So, for example, you may find that, 700,000 people are looking at your site every month, are looking at your content, or 700 people, it doesn't really matter, okay? It is a score that tells you what the situation is today. It doesn't really scream action to me. It just tells me how I'm doing, right? And I could judge that this way or that, depending on my goals, but it's just data that sits there that says how I'm doing. And that is useful if, for example, I look at a trend over time. So if I see the number of people that are accessing my documentation is going up over time, then I can see that the needle is moving. But looking at this data, it doesn't really tell me what to do to make that needle move. It just tells me what the situation is today, okay? So that's scorecard data. But the really meaty one, the really chewy one, the one that's really delicious is actionable data. Because actionable data is data that screens action. That means that I need to go do something in order to move that needle. And that's effective, that's powerful, because I look at this data and then I get up and I go, oh my God, I've got to do this in order to make this better. So it doesn't just show you what the needle is, it also strongly suggests a certain action that would help make that better, okay? Great. So now we're going to look at some ideas of data, some real data screenshots, and let's try to decide whether this data is useless, scorecard, or actionable. Okay.
We could have done one of those surveys for these.
Yes, we could. In fact, that might be coming up shortly. Okay, so we've got data, we've got this data on the site here, and this data shows traffic on a site, not traffic in a car, but people visiting a site, and they're visiting the site, and during the day it goes up, and during the night it goes down. And then during the next day, it goes up again. And then during the night, it goes down, okay? And so on, okay? And then I believe towards the end, here on the right-hand side, it's December 24th to 31. You can see that during the New Year period, Christmas and New Year, the traffic was lower, okay? So the question, the golden question is this useless data? Is it scorecard data? Or is it actionable data?
That's tough.
That's a tough one. Okay. Now, why could this? Okay, so on the surface, it looks like it might be useless data because we kind of know that people are more active during the day and less active during the night. So we kind of know that. Okay. So one would tend to think that this is useless data. However, and this is very interesting, we'll go into this in a little while, it actually depends on your goals. Because if your goal is to try to improve your documentation department, you're not going to get much from this data, so it's useless. But if your goal is, I need to pick a time to perform maintenance on the site, well then this data suddenly becomes not just useless, not just scorecard, but it's actually very actionable because it means that I need to pick the lowest time in order to perform that maintenance. So we actually learn something very important from here. What we learn is that data on its own is only part of the story. You have to attribute meaning to that data. You have to attribute direction or a goal to that data. And the goal then determines how useless or how actionable it is. Okay? Let's take a look at another example. All right, search effectiveness. This is a graph that shows the percentage of searches that led to a click. Okay? So if somebody performs a search on a site and they get some search results, but they didn't click on any of those search results, okay, then of course that's a negative. And if somebody clicks on the search result, then it's a positive, right? So it actually led somewhere, okay. And this is a graph over time showing the percentage of searches that led to a click. What would you say, Joe? Is that useless? Is that scorecard? Or is that actionable?
That's a good question. Well, it can definitely be useful to try to determine how our search is doing. Are people actually finding things that they need? So I would think it's not useless.
Okay.
On the other hand, nothing that I can really, doesn't point me to an action that I can actually do something with it.
Right.
So that would leave scorecard.
Correct. I would agree. Yes. Well done. So so scorecard. So this is definitely scorecard data. This is data that basically says how well am I doing? Are the people that are performing searches clicking on something, or are they ending frustrated because they didn't click on something and therefore they have to try again? Okay. All right, so let's try this one. This one is search relevancy. Search relevancy is a measure of if a person did click on a result, what number in the list of search results did they click on? Okay. So everybody knows that a really good search would make sure that people click on the first result or on one of the first few results, right? So you would expect that a really good search on a site would result in people clicking number 1, number 2, or number 3. And there's this old joke that, the best place to hide something is on page 2 of Google, right? Because nobody ever goes there, right? Because they just give up. So the idea would be that we would be looking at the search relevancy and we would be seeing where people did. The lower the number, in this case, the better we're doing. This is a bit strange. This is a bit of a strange graph.
Below the line.
Right, you want to be below the line, not above the line.
If we look at this, right? So we look at this scorecard. I think there's also probably a scorecard, right?
Right.
And if we look at this as very similar to the previous one, the search effectiveness, and because it helps us to determine, from let's say from a content creation point of view, how well our keywords are being inside of our titles and the first part of our content and things like that. So there's definitely things that we can do as content creators in order to improve the search efficiency, improve the search effectiveness. There's definitely things we can do to tweak the search engine, things like this. But there's definitely from a content creation point of view, taxonomy point of view, there's definitely things we can do to improve the effectiveness and the search relevancy. It's just that this doesn't tell us how to do it. It just tells us
how well we're doing.
Yeah, it tells us how well we're doing at this point.
Right, exactly. And that is, thank you, Joe. That was very nicely done because that really says exactly the difference between scorecard and actionable. If this were to tell me what to do or why my scores were so appalling, then it would be actionable. But right now, it's just telling me how well I'm doing. So that makes it scorecard. Take a look at another example. Let's look at this one. This one is a list of phrases that somebody types into the search that led to an empty result set. So search not found, results not found, 0 results, okay? Now, this is very interesting because this, depending on your point of view, some people would be embarrassed to look at this because this is a catalogue of failure, right? Because if you've got a site and you've got your beautiful content, but people are typing in searches and they are not finding anything, that is an abject failure. It means that they went to your site to look for it, they didn't find it, it's a problem, right? So this is a catalogue of failures, okay? But is it useful? Is it useless? Is it scorecard or is it actionable, okay? So what would you do with a phrase that you knew people were typing in and they didn't find anything, okay? So this is very interesting because depending on the tools that you have, you actually can do something with this. If you know, for example, that somebody is typing in the word endpoint, right? But you have a style guide that says, no, we've outlawed endpoints. We talk about devices, right? And this is very typical of organizations where they pick their terminology and they stick to it, right? Absolutely stick to it. And your editors are fastidious at making sure that everybody is complying, right? So what happens if somebody does indeed type in the word endpoint? They get no results. Now, I think that would be quite important for you to know, because first of all, you know, wait a second, hang on. We may be clear on our terminology, but our users are not. And our users are free to type in what they like, okay? So first of all, it's important on that level. But even more so, if your search engine offers the ability to create synonyms, for example, well, that would be extremely powerful, because then I would know that people are using a term that we thought they wouldn't be using. Okay, they do use it. And we could then tweak the search engine to perhaps make this equivalence so that the word that they are typing will always lead them to the word that we are using, or the phrase that we are using, right? So this is highly actionable. Okay? Take a look at another example. Okay. This one is very interesting, okay? Lots and lots of analytics dashboards have this one in, most popular topics, okay? So let's break this down. Useless, scorecard, or actionable, okay? So let's take a look at this. What would I do by knowing that my overview is my most popular topic? Not a lot. I can't think of anything. Okay, I just feel great because, okay, I wrote that topic and it makes me feel wonderful, right? My claim to fame, okay? But what am I going to do with that information? So it's not so very useful, okay? Is it, so it's not very actionable, okay? But what about scorecard? Does it tell me how well I'm doing? A little bit. It puts all of these topics in a relative list of popularity, okay? And I could perhaps try to hazard a guess at why maybe some topics are more popular than others. But I can't really do anything with it.
Right. This is an example of when, you know, overview is not so actionable, like you said, but knowing, like, if there's certain topics that are being used over and over again because people are having a hard time using that particular feature or function, or people are doing a lot of upgrades, for example.
Right.
So that gives you insight about, you know, what people are maybe having hard time with in your interface, or getting indication of how many people over time are really in a certain, you know, popularity of topic in a certain time frame, how many people are actually going ahead and doing an upgrade or whatever. So this can help us to get insights about what people are doing with our products, how successful they're being using the products, etc.
Correct. But it's a little bit indirect, and we might be able to feed this back, given a whole bunch of assumptions that maybe they're doing this because the UI sucks, or maybe they're doing this because they just have to do it and there's no way around it. There could be all kinds of reasons why people are looking at content, okay? So let's turn this around for a second. Let's imagine that instead of the most popular topics, this is going to be a list of least popular topics, okay? Now this is much more interesting, and again it gets a little bit embarrassing for some, because okay, you've got the top 20 or the bottom 20 topics, the ones that hardly anybody is looking at, okay? Now this suddenly is very different and very interesting, and perhaps very actionable as well, because if people are not looking at my beautiful content that I've spent ages writing, the question is why? And they need this content, don't they? Don't they? They should need this content, right? So if they're not getting to this content, why are they not getting to this content? Okay? And then you can perhaps look possibly at ways in which you might change the way in which your search engine weighs certain phrases, okay? Or you might change the navigation to promote the importance of some topics that are getting very low clicks, okay? So this is very interesting because you can have an axis where you have the most popular and the least popular. It's definitely interesting that the least popular topics have more to tell us than the most popular topics.
It's interesting because this actually helps us to diverge between, you know, like between something like Google Analytics, which is very popular,
Yes.
and analytics, which is really tied into a delivery system which knows all the content that you have, right? So, you know, if, like, for example, Google Analytics, for example, would not know any topic that gives 0 clicks because it only knows when someone clicks on it.
Right. Right.
And that really moves into the distinction between, you know, analytics and insights that are driven by a system that understands, you know, not only just clicks and traffic, but the underlying content that's being put in there and the characteristics of that content and how often it's being updated, which Lauren's going to talk about.
Right. And also, of course, you want to try to hone the data that you are collecting to make them much more actionable and much less useless, right? So let's take another example. This one is content aging, okay? So this is the amount of content that has been up for ages and hasn't been updated. So it's getting a little bit stale, a little bit gray, like some presenters, for example. There is the content that is a bit more fresh-faced, like other presenters, and then there's the brand new content, which is still in diapers, right? So looking at a graph like this and seeing how much content is very old and how frequently you are updating your content. Is most of your content new, or is most of your content that is up there quite old? Okay. So what would you call this? Useless, scorecard, or actionable?
This is actually a trick a little bit, because on the one hand, this is like scorecard, right?
Right.
On the other hand, once you click on it and drill down, then you can actually see which topics are old and then make some insights about them, what to do about that. So
right.
It's like you know, you can kind of click down and drill down and say, okay, let me actually develop a report of all these ones and based on these metrics.
Yeah, and then what would you do? Let's say you do find an old topic. What's wrong with it? There's nothing wrong with content that's old if it's still relevant, right? So it's still, you know, between scorecard and actionable. It's not that actionable on its own. But now I'm going to propose a radical idea, okay? Let's imagine that we take those last two measurements and we create a graph. On the horizontal axis, we're going to put freshness. And on the vertical axis, we're going to put popularity, okay? And then what we'll do is that we'll plot all of our content on this graph as little dots, okay? Each topic or each publication has a certain popularity and a certain freshness. And then you can imagine that if you have, you know, a gazillion topics, then you would have these clouds of dots along this graph, around this graph. And then what we can do is divide this graph into 4 quadrants. And let's look at what each of these quadrants mean. Okay. In the bottom left, any content that is in here is old content that no one is really reading. Okay. Well, that's quite actionable, I think, because that's old content that no one is reading, that is taking up space and taking up memory and taking up search results that nobody really is looking for, nobody is interested in. Or maybe it's time to retire that content. That's actionable. Let's have a look at the next quadrant. The next quadrant is new content that no one is reading. I think that's a definite contender for oh my God, right? Because this is brand new content. I put it out there, humming and hawing. I'm very, very proud of my new content. No one is getting to it. So this is an OMG quadrant. This is what are we going to do about this? So what can we do? This is also actionable. If this is new content that no one is reading, perhaps we can promote it. Perhaps we can put some banners on our site to point people to this new content. Perhaps we can change the tiles or the navigation to expose this content more readily. Okay? There's lots of action to do here. take a look at the next one. The next one is everyone is reading this old content. Very popular, very old. Okay, so how do we feel about that? Well.
I'm sure you'll all have a lot to say about that. So you're looking for that button on the thing.
So everyone is reading old content. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Is that something you want or is that something you don't want? Well, if it's old and everyone is reading it, maybe it's because they've got old versions of the content of your product, okay? And maybe it's quite valid. Or maybe it's not what you want at all. And what you actually want is that everybody should be reading new content. And a lot of people feel that where they really want to be is in the top right quadrant. And the top right quadrant is your actionable thing. It's where you want everyone to move. Now, of course, it really depends on your content, on your product ecosystem, on your goals. And this, I think, is what's quite important here. So that would lead us to our second and final polling question, where you can vote in the voting section, votes from the audience. And our question is, how would you categorize the data that you use to drive your documentation strategy? Okay. So cast your vote now. Do you gather useless data? Do you gather scorecard data? Or do you gather actionable data?
Okay. We've seen the results come in. Most of you all, half of you all are collecting mostly scorecard data. Some of you are admitting to of collecting mostly useless content or data. Sorry. That was a slip.
It was a horrible slip.
Some of you are about 20% of you are mostly actionable, and some of you are like, what kind of data am I collecting? Mm-hmm. So right now it's pretty much what you guys continue to vote. But right now, it seems like about 15% of you or so are collecting mostly useless data, and then maybe about 60% are collecting, scorecard and actionable data, which is already, becoming somewhat useful.
Right. And this is really where you want to get to. You want to get to a place where all of the data that you are gathering is actionable.
Okay, thanks for participating in the polling question.
So what we're finding is that effective data, together with goals, that's what leads to a clear action, and it is the goals that really make the difference. So, for example, using our thing before, if you have a goal that says that customers must read newer content, then you have some very clear action items. Like, for example, removing the older content, promoting newer content with announcements and navigation, and perhaps tweaking your search engine to guide people towards newer content. So what you find is that goals add an element of judgment. They judge whether the data that you are seeing is desired or unwanted. Okay, it's a success or a failure. And what's really important is to try to see how you can gather data that makes your manager, that makes alternative teams in the company meet their KPIs.
Yeah. We can go back to that for a second before we move on to the key takeaway. So yeah, this is helping us to really, again, going back to that idea of mapping between the goals of the organization and really, like what I just mentioned, being able to map the analytics or mapping the metrics that you're collecting, the data collecting, and really mapping that to the overall KPIs, which really map up to the goals. And it could be, there's some metrics which are very useful or very interesting and maybe even actionable, but just don't have any effect at all into the goals, and therefore you're just kind of wasting energy and maybe improving a metric which is no one really cares about. So kind of looking at the overall goals and KPIs, and then really mapping the metrics and the actionable metrics in order to to get that effective goals and effective success in your organization.
Okay, so we've come to the last slide, which is about key takeaways. So what have we got for you today? So what we've spoken about is what your role is in the organization, and we really feel that you define your role best by figuring out what impact you have on the wider organization. Okay, and you can do that, and then, of course, look in the mirror and feel very proud that you are contributing measurable business value, because now we're gathering data and making it much more measurable. We also see that tech docs have an impact across the organization, not just linearly upwards through the hierarchy. And we spoke about differentiating between scorecard and actionable data, and of course useless data, which we're trying not to talk about. And whenever you have those goals, try to see how those goals align with your corporate goals, and how you can use those KPIs to measure how well you are doing in that alignment. And of course, the data of the effectiveness of your department, of your organization in the company, and the team productivity, that's what we are gathering data for those two aspects, the effectiveness in the company and the productivity of your team.
Excellent. So I think we have some time for some questions. So let's see.
Excellent. Joe, are you still there? Can you hear me?
We can.
Excellent. So I've got some questions for you from the audience. First, I'd like to say, I think that you guys touched on some great stuff at the beginning of the program where you talked about the impact of product content, I guess to kind of make the business case of that. And we had a viewer who asked if you could talk a little bit more about how all of that happens. And I think that may not be appropriate necessarily for the remaining 8 minutes that we have in today's show. So maybe we could do a follow-up webinar on that. But could you touch on the portion of the how? What's really involved in trying to integrate data? What are the challenges that most technical communication teams might face when they first start to go down this path?
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, you go first.
Okay, I think the biggest problem is picking the data that will help you make a difference. Okay, so there's lots of data, and this is why we chose to talk about this, about the different types of data. If you're going to start measuring things, you can measure things in all different ways. There are lots of tools out there and so on. But it's about choosing the data that really makes an impact, that allows you to be actionable, to move the needle, and to look at how that data can be used by everyone's KPIs, not just yours, in order to make them do a better job. And that kind of brings you into the center of everyone's world.
Right. The second part of that is where the content is being accessed. So people are accessing content in different ways. Your content might be surfaced, or some of it might be on your corporate website. Some of them might be in your community. Some of them might be surfaced up in a like a case management system that the support people are using to manage cases. Some of this content might be surfaced up in your product as in-product assistance or in-product help. And it's important that this data, when we talk about that how, it's really important that the usage of this content, the searchability of the content, how long people are reading the content, all kinds of metrics and triggers we can be measuring these days, needs to be across all the touch points or all the channels where people are accessing this content. That's very, very important. It's not just a matter of putting Google Analytics on my website, because my website might be a very small percentage, right, or a limited percentage of how people are really accessing the content.
Right, it might not be the whole story. So you may have a dev portal, or the content may be in other places, and you really need full coverage. Right. because if you're not looking at your dev portal, then you're missing a huge audience that is looking at your content.
The second aspect of that third actually is, go ahead. One last sentence before you move on to that. And the other one is, like we mentioned before, is that it's not just about clicks. It's about understanding what content is available, how old that content is, and a lot of characteristics of the content is not just available, not just accessible via standard Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics that's attached to your website.
Do any of your customers use a feedback button that they believe that customers will somehow tell them that their content is fabulous or not pushing the button? The reason I ask is because I've had usability specialists on the show who say that those buttons are nice to have, but the science behind it is that people don't actually use them that way. If they're pissed, they can't wait to tell you, but if they're happy, they may or may not. Do you have any feedback mechanism recommendations, and are they believable just because you put them on there? Does it mean that your content's not successful if people don't click the button?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll say something quickly, and then Lawrence will answer as well. So listen, the feedback, there's a couple of different types of feedback. One is, typing in a comment, and you're right, few people will rate a comment, wow, this content was amazing, right? But there's also ratings, like either like a 5-star rating or some kind of a heat map or something that indicates the quality of the content. So you really want to have both of them. You want to have them in a way that's easily accessible. You want to have something that someone clicks on something that the rating is low, to have something automatically pop up so you can actually give write-in feedback. And then also, both of those also help to answer, to understand more about the engagement. It's not just about the feedback itself, but it's a part of the measurement of engagement with the content.
Right, and I think it's very important to differentiate between explicit feedback and implicit feedback. So, for example, what you described now with these feedback boxes, that's explicit feedback, and you're right, there's little traction there in most cases, unless somebody has something really strong to say. However, if you're looking at lots of analytics that we've been looking at now, then you can see how much people have been scrolling, how long they've been spending on the page, if they've been sharing the content with other people, or posting it somewhere else, or creating PDFs from that, and you can see the level of interaction. Well, that's an implicit feedback. It's an implicit vote of confidence, because you can see that people are really engaged in this. So feedback comes in many different ways, and I think implicit feedback is as valid as explicit feedback.
That's a great point. I'm going to cut you off and tell you that we're going to try to get one more question in before I close out the show. So we have some very opinionated people on this show as viewers today that have their own experiences. And one of the comments that I'm going to try to interpret and turn into a question is that this particular viewer says that they look at section views, in other words, popularity. So they're looking at the difference between if one post has 1,000 views a month and another has 100, then they give the one that has the 1,000 views a higher priority, whatever that means, because they believe it has the largest reach. What are your thoughts? And their question is, are they doing it wrong?
Well, it's a little bit of a feedback loop. So it depends which one came first, the chicken or the egg. Maybe lots of people are coming to this page because it's the one that's most prominently promoted. Or maybe they're coming to this page because it's the one with the best content. You don't really know the answer to that. So that's why we find that the more interesting statistic is the one is looking at where people aren't going rather than where people are going.
That makes perfect sense. And the data scientist and me just gave you a large round of applause for that. so thank you for that. The final question, and it's just a detangling of an acronym that you used earlier that I don't believe I heard you clarify later. One of our audience members asked if you could tell him what him or her what AHT is. A apple, H hat, T Tom.
It's average handling time. It's the time that it takes for a support person to handle a call. So you want to try to lower that as a support manager.
Excellent. You brought up so many questions. I'm going to put together a list of them for one of our future shows, because I definitely think we should show people how this changes their job. And we're getting ready to do a survey of our webinar audience to figure out what they like about our webinars and what they don't. I'm pretty sure we'll get some great feedback that will help us make some improvements in the shows in the future that will give you guys a great opportunity to demonstrate some of these techniques for people. So thank you both for joining us today. And thank you to Zoomin Software for being our sponsors. Global companies like Dell, ServiceNow, and McAfee rely on Zoomin's digital experience platform to increase customer satisfaction, do other things like reduce churn and drive revenue. And they do that by delivering a dynamic digital experience across a variety of customer touch points. You can learn more and even schedule a demo today to find out how you can modernize your content strategy to meet the new industry standards. There's a direct link to a demo request in the attachments section of your webinar viewing panel. And if you click on that and fill out the information, the folks from Zoomin will make a personal invitation to you to demonstrate the software and answer any questions you might have in private. I know many of you have confided in me that sharing some of your questions would be better done in private because you don't want everybody else on the webinar to know what you're asking, so I appreciate that. Thanks very much to you gentlemen for joining our show today.
Thank you for having us. Thanks for your participation.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us. To the audience members too, Joe and Lawrence's information is available in the attachments and links section of your viewing panel. And if you do me a favor and cast a rating for them on a 1 through 5 stars on the quality of the content they provided today. 1 is a low rating, 5 is high. There's even a little field you can type in a comment if you'd like to share something with Joe and Lawrence. I know they appreciate that feedback. My name is Scott Abel, and you've been watching Data-Driven Documentation, How to Become Data-Driven Documentation Team with Joe Gelb and Lawrence Orin of Zoomin Software. And I hope that you'll join us at our upcoming webinar. We have on March the 10th, we're going to present a session on building effective and simple animated GIFs in minutes. You're not going to want to miss that. Stay tuned to the Content Wrangler channel on Bright Talk for more webinars on content and how it can improve your job. Thanks for joining us again. I'm Scott Abel, your host, signing off. Thanks. See you at our next webinar.